Hi folks, welcome back once again to your hottest source for all live, all local Google slides in the Santa Cruz County area. Now today, I'm going to start by talking about a thing that Romans just love. You know, they love their, war monuments? Not exactly war monuments. Kind of war brags, just monuments to their own victories. This is the Arch of Titus, which commemorates the reconquest and destruction of Jerusalem under that emperor. Showing in this scene just hauling a whole bunch of stuff away from Jerusalem, just stealing a bunch of stuff that Titus had got there after conquering the city. And Rome, if you ever visited, is full of monuments like this. You got all your various arches, you got your various columns, monuments mostly to big Roman victories. Romans love this stuff. But you gotta wonder, what does this kind of thing look like from the other side? Well, we do have some examples, and today I'm going to be focusing on a really particularly interesting one, and that is the reliefs and inscriptions of Shabur I at a place called Naqsh Rostam, the image of Rostam, which is, I guess, what early observers thought this guy looked like. Rostam is a kind of an epic hero from the Iranian tradition. The site's also known as the Ka'ba of Zoroaster, or the Ka'ba of Zoroaster, for similar kind of later speculative reasons. But this is a victory monument that records the defeat, murder, and capture of 3 separate Roman emperors, which is a pretty good catch. If you're Shabur I, Shabur was the second king in the Sassanid dynasty, a dynasty that ruled over Persia, starting in about 226, which, again, I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, is my office number, so if you ever need a mnemonic for that, it is the beginning of Sassanid rule in Persia. Who are the Sassanids and why should you care? Well, it's always hard to answer that latter question vis-a-vis history, but here they are. They come in kind of the middle of the history of Iran, right? But they rule over an area that's centered on Persia. Classical Persis is their own dynastic homeland. Istakhr, their home city, is very close to Persepolis, the capital city of the Achaemenids. And the Sassanids do identify themselves with the Achaemenids in terms of their inscriptional style, but a lot of other things as well. They may interestingly have been the first dynasty actually to call this area that we now know as Iran, Iran. The ethnic designation Iranian had been used by the Achaemenids, but to identify the space of Persia and Media and a few surrounding places as Iran really seems to be a Sassanid innovation. So maybe that's why you care. So the Sassanids come around after a period of kind of weakness in Persia vis-a-vis the Romans. There are the Achaemenids, who you know if you've read Herodotus. They're the dynasty that invades Greece, that has this huge kind of empire. They're knocked over by Alexander the Great. The Seleucids come next. They're a notionally Greek dynasty that rules over much of the same space. They're eventually rolled by the Romans, opening the space up for this other dynasty called the Parthians or the Arsacids, who are Rome's kind of mostly punching bag in the Near East for the better part of their several hundred years of history. They do score a couple notable victories, most famous of which is the one that results in the death of Crassus, the triumvir, in the 70s BC. But they end up getting beaten a lot by the Romans. They slowly lose territory in Mesopotamia. And eventually they're overthrown by the Sassanids, who are this kind of a new dynasty, who come back very strong against the Romans in the 3rd century and 4th centuries CE. The Sassanids will last until the Eastern Roman Empire as a serious global power does, or as long as they do, because both the Sassanids and the Byzantines are defeated by the Muslim armies in the same year, 636, in decisive battles that sort of end the Byzantines as a serious military power and just take the Sassanid Empire off the map. The rest of it falls very quickly after the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636. So that's who the Sassanids are, and like I said, they come on very strong with their first couple of kings. You got Ardashir, who's the first one who actually takes power. You see him here sharing a fist bump with somebody who is either Ahura Mazda or a Zoroastrian priest. The latter identification is more convincing, probably because Ahura Mazda is not the kind of guy who needs to ride a horse. Ahura Mazda is the main god of Zoroastrianism, and he usually flies around inside of a little winged solar disk instead of riding a horse. But somebody's giving Ardashir here the fist bump of power. Actually, they're trading a giant ring with ribbons attached to it, which is the symbol of Sassanid royal power. It's the Khafarna, or Farh, the halo of the King of Kings, the Shahanshah. Ardashir does a lot of conquering, but that's nothing compared to what Shapur I, his son, does. And here's what happens. Well, right away, basically, when Shapur's reign starts, Gordian Caesar attacks him. Gordian is the third in a series of Gordians. There were 3 Gordians who came into power. The rest of them all died within the same year. And so this Gordian survived and ended up actually in charge of Rome and attacked what he considered to be a fledgling and weak dynast in Persia. Well, that didn't go very well for him. He was decisively defeated in Mesopotamia, basically, the province around Babylonia. Gordian Caesar was killed not in battle, probably by his own men after that loss. He was replaced by Philip Caesar, Philip the Arab, who was a sort of temporary emperor. Well, he ended up ruling for a few years, but he was appointed as emperor basically to negotiate a retreat for the defeated Roman army. And paid off Shapur in probably 500,000 gold denarii, which is a lot, and agreed to be to make the Roman Empire a tributary state to the Sassanids. So at this point, the Romans, as big as they are in a position of vassalship to this relatively new dynasty of the Sassanids. There is another conflict under Philip, supposedly a result of deception by Philip. And for the Persians, at least the ones who are conventional Zoroastrians, lying is the worst thing you can do. So this is something that you'll see ascribed to enemy powers, enemy rulers, in Sassanid inscriptions, but also in Achaemenid inscriptions. Achaemenid inscriptions which all date from like 700 years before the Sassanids came to power, so you can see there's a certain amount of continuity and also deliberate reaching back on the part of the Sassanids to this kind of earlier vocabulary of power and of religion. Well, the third blow is the hardest, and that's when the next Caesar, Valerian, goes after goes after Persia in 260, trying to recover some of the lands which were lost during this earlier kind of encounter with Gordian and Philip. And this seems like it's going okay for a while. Valerian pushes the Sassanid army back to Edessa, referred to as Orha here. See my previous mini talk on Edessa if you're for some reason interested in that. And there's a big fight, and there the whole Roman army is captured, at least the part that isn't killed. And that includes the emperor. That includes Valerian, who spends the rest of his not all that long life in a cage in Istakhr. He is eventually killed. His skin is kept around, painted red. They bring it out whenever Roman diplomats come to visit, just to rub it in a bit. And that is, for a time at least, the end of Roman attempts to roll back the Sassanian advances in Mesopotamia and the Near East. Well, this is one way to look at the inscription. It's one approach to take to the inscription, to look to it to see what it can tell us about Roman history. It's kind of a Romocentric approach to the inscription. Now you can see how looking at the inscription with those interests in mind might cause us to miss a lot of it, right? Because it's not written for Roman historians to use as a source. It's not about Rome, it's about Persia. It's about Sassanian Persia. So we would do well to try to pay attention to what the inscription is actually telling us, rather than just mining it as a kind of a source for Roman history. And indeed, most of the inscription is not that. The account of these campaigns does have a place of prominence. It comes relatively close to the beginning of the inscription, but it's not the bulk of the inscription. A lot of the inscription is credits. Shapur mentions basically every important official in his empire, all his palace officials. And this is not just to give credit where credit is due, but also to show that he's got this fairly well-developed bureaucracy built up. Like, he controls a complicated and articulate state. He's not just some warlord leading an army around. There is this whole kind of state apparatus that works out of his palace that manages this vast empire. The credits are a way of showing his power. He's also very interested in establishing his religious affiliation, as a great deal of the inscription is dedicated to the description of sacrifices that he organizes to celebrate his victories, sacrifices that he organizes for the benefit of various family members of his, and a number of eternal flames, Adoran, which he establishes for, again, various of his family members. And this is it seems a kind of a Zoroastrian ritual, the substance of which is a little bit lost to us because it's not really practiced anymore, since Zoroastrianism is now practiced on such a diminished scale. But in that religion, fire is an object of worship, or at least accorded a place of pride in temples. So it seems that when he's lighting a fire, he's establishing temples in the name of his various family members. His wife, his children. So that's 5 fire temples in all. And this seems to be a big part of the way that the Sassanian Empire succeeds, kind of where the Parthian Empire had failed. Sassanian rulers are always much more skilled manipulators of religion, much savvier about religion than the Arsacids had been. So in the first few generations, there's this kind of interplay between rigorous worship of Ahura Mazda, Mazdaism, A little bit broader sense of Zoroastrianism that includes figures like Anahit, who had been earlier members of the Sassanid family before they came into power, had been priests of Anahit. Anahit is an important Iranian goddess. And also the Manichaeans are in the mix for some time. So eventually the empire is going to organize itself as a kind of Zoroastrian state with broad tolerance for other faiths. That tolerance comes and goes. But you can see already in this inscription that Shapur is identifying himself with Zoroastrian religion, with the Zoroastrian priesthood, with Zoroastrian temple foundations. This is a way, it seems like people will take it as a way of establishing grounds for unity in his empire that go beyond just what he's telling people to do. It's also a way of legitimating and glorifying his own power. And this comes out right in the intro, where he says, I, the Mazda-worshipping God Sapor, King of Kings, King of Iranians and non-Iranians, from a family of kings, the son of the Mazda-worshipping god Ardashir, the King of Kings, ruler over just the Iranians. What's going on here is that Shapur is identifying himself. He says, I'm a Mazdasnes, Mazdieshin. Mazdayasn, I am a worshipper of Mazda. It's a term that means Zoroastrian, basically. Not only that, I am divine and of divine family. Not only that, I rule over both Iran, the sacred space that belongs to the Iranian ethnicity, and non-Iran, on Iran. The wording is a little bit different in the Middle Persian version. Doesn't say he's from a family of gods. He says that his image is from the gods. Basically, his body has been divinely designed. There again seem to be a lot of callbacks here to Achaemenid inscriptions, some intentional, some coincidental. I don't really want to go back into that because that would make this talk more than usually boring. But from the get-go, he's telling us that this is an inscription about sacred power. It's not just about beating Rome, but about what kind of person could beat Rome. A person to whom Ahura Mazda has shown favor. And what we're looking at here, while we're looking at it, why don't we talk about the languages of the inscription a bit? Interesting, there are 3 languages. They are presented here in a published edition of the inscription, which is in the bibliography to follow, not in the order on which they appear on the inscription. On the inscription, Greek is last. Middle Persian, the youngest language in terms of having a writing system attached to it, is first, and then Parthian. There's a political meaning to this. Parthian is the language of the defeated dynasty, the Parthian dynasty, so it's been demoted to second place. Middle Persian is the language of the Sassanians and their homeland in Persis, so it's tops. Even though, again, it's relatively new as a written language, it owes a lot to Parthian for its alphabetic conventions. And Greek is at the bottom. Greek, I think, pretty clearly here identified as the language of Romans. Although it should not be underestimated the extent to which there remain kind of Hellenized populations in the Sasanian Empire. But Greek is at the bottom. Well, you gotta wonder, why include Greek at all? And you can think of a few reasons which have been proposed by scholars. One is that you do get to show it getting stepped on by Middle Persian and Parthian, in much the same way as the the corpse of Gordian gets trampled on by Shopper's horse, not really visible in this relief, but visible in other reliefs that Shopper put up elsewhere. Much the same way as Shopper is subjugating the Roman emperors that you do see him subjugating, right? In this inscription, you can see Philip the Arab. He's the one who's kneeling. He's shown as paying tribute, and you can see Valerian. He's the one that Shopper's got all tied up. His hands he's holding. So in much the same way as Shopper is subjugating those Roman emperors, Persian and Parthian are subjugating the Greek language. The Greeks in the later Islamic tradition and also in the Middle Persian tradition are just called Romaioi. They're identified as Romans. The other thing is, well, people were expected to read this, probably, and carry it back across the frontier into Rome. This is a form of propaganda. If you want the inscription to have propaganda value in a part of the world where people speak Greek and don't know Persian, then you got to put a Greek version of the inscription up. So you're expecting diplomats, merchants, anyone who comes over the border separating the Roman world from the Sassanian world, to look at the inscription, maybe even write it down. We have cases where merchants elsewhere wrote inscriptions down and inserted them in books. But certainly give people the gist of it back in the Roman world. So the Greek part of the inscription, which is the part that's now most legible, both because we know the language already and because a good deal of the other inscriptions have been sort of worn away. The Greek inscription functions like a weapon. Many inscriptions in the ancient world are sort of war continued by other means. This is probably more true of the Shapur inscription in Nakhshe-Rostam than it is even of the victory monuments that you see all over Rome that I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture. It's not just a way for the ruler to stroke his own ego about having won wars, but it's a way for him to continue to wage those wars, even after they're over. Well, that's it for tonight. I appreciate your attention. Everybody stay safe and isolated, and I'll see you next year. See you next week, same time, same place, same web app.